There are images that shouldn't exist. 19th century photographs showing magnificent multi-story buildings with stone columns and arched windows partially sunk into the ground. Streets where the ground level reaches halfway up a facade that was clearly designed to be viewed from much lower down. Entire cities that appear in those old photos completely empty, without a single human being in sight, as if something had swept away the entire population in one fell swoop. Millions of people have seen those images, and millions of people have asked the same question. Who built all this, and where did they go? The answer that has circulated in recent years is as disturbing as it is compelling, that at some point around 1850, perhaps earlier, perhaps a little later, something happened. An event of biblical proportions that buried entire cities under tons of mud. An advanced, sophisticated civilization capable of building structures we would today call monumental was literally buried. And the few survivors who remained, a reduced and disoriented humanity, emerged from the rubble, dug out what they could, and started over, pretending that they themselves had built all of it. It is a powerful story. It is a story that explains a great deal. And it is, in almost all its fundamental details, a story that never happened. But the reason it didn't happen is infinitely more interesting than the story itself. Because behind the theory of the Great Mud Flood there is something real. There are real photographs. There are real buildings with architectural features that seem impossible to explain. There are cities that were indeed buried. There are towns that did indeed disappear. And there is a 19th century story that is, in many ways, so dramatic and so tumultuous that it would make any conspiracy theory pale with envy. What you are about to discover is not simply that the mud flood theory is false. It's why it's false. It's where it came from. It's who invented it, for what purpose, and how it made its way from the nationalist circles of post-Soviet Russia to the phones of millions of people in Latin America, Europe, and the entire world. And it is, above all, what really happened in the 19th century. Because what really happened is a story that no one has ever told you with this clarity. A story of cities that burned down and were rebuilt in a matter of months, of engineers who literally moved mountains, of streets that rose several meters overnight while people continued living in their homes, of a humanity that was not buried by the mud, but buried the mud beneath its own feet, deliberately, in order to survive. That is the truth revealed. Let's start from the beginning. The year is 2016. The internet is no longer what it was in 2000. It is no longer simply a place to search for information. It is an ecosystem where information reproduces, mutates, and adapts to survive. And in that ecosystem, in the dimly lit corners of YouTube and Reddit, a very particular type of content begins to circulate. Images of buildings with strange features, windows that end underground, doors that lead directly into the basement, black and white photographs of completely deserted European and North American cities with those massive, ornate structures in the background with no one inhabiting them. The images are real. The buildings are real. That is the first thing to understand. There is no photo manipulation. There are no montages. The architectural anomalies that people point out in those videos exist. They are there, and anyone can verify them. The question is what they mean. And the answer those early videos propose goes like this. At some point in recent history, much more recent than we've been told, there existed a global civilization of extraordinary technological and cultural sophistication. It was called by various names, but the one that became most widely known was the Tartarian Empire. A civilization that would have built the great neoclassical buildings that today adorn the world's capitals, that would have mastered free energy, that would have achieved a level of social organization that we, their supposed heirs, have not yet managed to replicate. And then, sometime around 1850, something destroyed them. A global deluge of mud, a catastrophic event that buried their cities, killed most of their population, and left only a handful of survivors who, over time, organized themselves to excavate what they could, repopulate the cities with people who knew nothing of what that previous world had been, and rewrite history to hide the truth. The theory has an undeniable structural elegance. It explains the buried windows, it explains the deserted cities in the photos, it explains why the grandest buildings of the 19th century seem too sophisticated for the technical capabilities of the time. It explains why the name Tartaria disappears from maps around that same time. It even explains the unusual number of orphaned children roaming Europe and America in the second half of the 19th century. The theory explains everything because it is designed to explain everything. And precisely that, is the first sign that something is wrong. A good historical theory does not explain everything. A good historical theory explains something specific in a verifiable way, leaving open what is not yet known. Theories that explain everything without leaving anything open to verification are not historical theories. They are mythology. But mythology has power. And the mud flood myth has more power than most, because it originated in a very specific place and for a very specific purpose that its current followers, for the most part, are completely unaware of. Let's go back further, much further. We are in the Soviet Union. The year is 1973. A mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko, a specialist in topology at Moscow State University and a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, begins applying statistical methods to historical texts. He is a brilliant mathematician. His contributions to topology are legitimate and recognized by his colleagues. But at some point, that mathematical mind begins to see patterns in ancient history that, according to him, make no sense. Historical texts from different eras and civilizations are too similar to one another, he argues. The chronologies don't add up. Dating methods are unreliable. And he concludes something that his fellow historians will unanimously and categorically reject: that the entire ancient history of Greece, Rome, and Egypt is actually the same story, repeated and misdated. That the events we know as ancient actually occurred during the Middle Ages, and that, at the center of it all, there was a great Russian Slavic empire called Great Tartary that was the true driving force of human history. The international historical and scientific community rejected these ideas from the very beginning, not as a debatable or open to interpretation position, but as pseudoscience, incompatible with archaeology, with carbon-14 dating, with dendrochronology, with centuries of verified documentation. But Fomenko's books sell. They sell very well. Over 1 million copies in Russia. Why? Because context matters. The Soviet Union has just collapsed. Russia is in an unprecedented identity crisis. The system that promised the future of humanity crumbled in a matter of years. The economy is in ruins. The sense of national humiliation is profound. And in that context, the idea that Russia and the Slavic world were actually the center of a great global civilization that was suppressed and hidden by Western powers and the Vatican. That idea has an emotional resonance that needs no evidence to work. It is comfort. It is pride. It is a narrative that transforms defeat into conspiracy. An occultist named Nikolai Levashov takes Fomenko's ideas and takes them further. He adds elements of esoteric racism, theories about a superior Slavic Aryan race, and an apocalyptic narrative about the deliberate destruction of that ancient world by dark forces. The organization he founds is classified as a destructive cult by the Russian Orthodox Church. But his texts circulate, are translated, and adapted. For decades, all of this remains confined to Russian far-right and nationalist occult circles. And then comes 2016. Video platforms have completely changed the nature of how ideas spread. YouTube's algorithm does not distinguish between an academic documentary and a 20-minute video with piano music and photos of underground windows. Both compete for the same attention span. And in that competition, mystery always has the advantage over complexity. The unanswered question always holds more appeal than the verifiable explanation. Someone uploads a video, then another, then 10, then 100, and the mud flood theory begins its global expansion. But something very significant occurs in that process of expansion. The theory becomes detached from its context. Russian nationalism, racial Slavism, Levashov's occultism, all of that disappears in translation. What remains is the universally appealing part, a great lost civilization, a hidden catastrophe, a nameless elite controlling history. No Russian face, no visible political agenda. That's what travels. That's what gets shared. And it gets shared because the images are real. Let's return to the images, because they deserve a serious response, not dismissal. Let's start with the most well-documented case of all, the one the mud flood theory most frequently uses as evidence. The city of Seattle, in the state of Washington, on the northwest coast of the United States. If you visit Seattle today and take the Seattle Underground Tour, a sightseeing tour that has existed since 1965 and is open to anyone, you'll descend several meters below the current streets of the Pioneer Square neighborhood and walk through what were street-level streets in 1888. You'll see stores with their facades intact, windows that are now completely underground but once had the street right outside them, passages that were once public sidewalks. It is exactly what the mudslide theory describes, a buried city. Except there is no mystery. There are records, newspapers, city records, photographs of the event, testimonies from engineers, everything perfectly documented. On June 6, 1889, a fire broke out in the basement of a carpenter's shop in downtown Seattle. Within hours, it destroyed 25 blocks of the commercial district. 25 blocks. 120 acres of the city reduced to rubble in a single summer afternoon. There were no fatalities, but the material destruction was total. And this is where the real story becomes so dramatic that it renders any conspiracy theory unnecessary. City leaders, while the rubble was still smoldering, made a bold decision. They weren't simply going to rebuild what had been there. They were going to use the disaster to solve the problem that had plagued Seattle since its founding. The city had been built on marshy land, literally on wetlands along the edge of Elliott Bay. Every time the tide came in, the city's sewers backed up and the streets flooded with sewage. The city stank. The city got sick. So they decided to raise the level of the streets, not by a few centimeters, several meters, in some places up to 8 meters. The process took years. During that time, Seattle was a city on 2 simultaneous levels. The new elevated streets already existed, but the building entrances were still at the old level, several meters below. To enter a store, you had to descend a staircase from the sidewalk. To cross from one sidewalk to another, you had to jump a considerable distance because the street level was now the new one. But the buildings kept their entrances at the old level. Eventually, when the elevation was complete, the owners simply abandoned the lower level. The old entrances were closed off. The new street remained above, and the original level remained below, intact, suddenly turned into a basement, without anyone having planned it exactly that way. That is the Seattle Underground. It is not the remnant of a lost civilization. It is an urban engineering decision made for sanitary reasons, documented in dozens of 19th century primary sources that anyone can consult today. But Seattle is just the most famous case. It is not the only one. In the 1850s, Chicago had a similar problem. The city had been built practically at the level of Lake Michigan, on poorly draining land that turned into a swamp of dirty water and waste during rainy seasons. Diseases were endemic. Typhoid fever killed hundreds of people every year. The solution implemented was to raise the entire city, not metaphorically, literally. Hydraulic jacks were manufactured on an industrial scale. They were placed under the foundations of the buildings, and the buildings, with people inside, businesses operating, hotels and banks open, were raised several meters while crews of workers filled in the space below. This is reported in the newspapers of the time. The Chicago Tribune of 1858 describes the process with the awe it deserves. A 6-story hotel lifted in its entirety while guests remained in their rooms. An entire block of shops raised while merchants continued to serve customers. There is no mystery. There is 19th century engineering, which was, though we may find it hard to believe at times, extraordinarily competent. And there is something even more important. When a city is raised several meters, the first floors of the oldest buildings, those that were not raised or demolished and rebuilt, end up below the new street level. Their windows are underground. Their doors are underground. Exactly what the mud flood theory points to as evidence of a catastrophic event. There is another explanation that applies to much older cities such as Rome, Istanbul, and Paris. The urban ground rises, not suddenly, gradually. The Romans abandoned damaged buildings rather than demolishing them completely. They built on top of the rubble. The streets became covered with dust, waste, and the debris of urban life. Year after year, century after century, the ground level rises a few centimeters. Over 2,000 years, that adds up to meters. Ancient Mediterranean cities have archaeological strata 10, 15, 20 meters deep, not because they were covered by a mud flood, because they were built upon themselves, time and again, now then. There is a legitimate question that deserves an honest answer. If all this has such clear explanations, if the records exist, if the documentation is available, why do the images still seem mysterious? Why do millions of people look at those photographs and feel that something doesn't add up? The answer has 2 parts. The first part is that the 19th century images are genuinely strange to the modern eye. Not for the reasons proposed by the mud flood theory, but for much more mundane and fascinating reasons. Mid-19th century cameras required very long exposure times. Not fractions of a second like today, minutes, sometimes tens of minutes. Any object moving during those minutes would be invisible in the photo. A standing person might appear slightly blurred. A walking person would not appear at all. The photos showing deserted cities do not show deserted cities. They show cities full of people moving, invisible to the camera because they were moving. The only ones who appear are those who remained motionless during the exposure time, which could be 5, 10, or 20 minutes. Those who sat down to rest. Those who were waiting for something. Those who deliberately posed for the photo. It is an image of time, not of space. It does not show where the people were. It shows what remained still long enough to leave a mark on the photosensitive material. The second part of the answer is psychological, and it is perhaps the most important of everything we are going to explore today. There is a mechanism in the human brain called pattern recognition. It is one of the most powerful cognitive mechanisms we possess. It allows us to recognize a face in a crowd, identify the sound of an animal in the dark, and detect danger before we can articulate in words what we are sensing. It is the mechanism that allowed us to survive as a species in environments we did not fully understand. But that same mechanism can be triggered in situations where there is no real pattern. It can see a face in the clouds. It can find meaning in coincidences. It can connect dots that were not originally connected. And when that mechanism works on old images of cities with unusual architectural features, in a context of distrust toward institutions and a widespread sense that something in the world is not right, it can construct very coherent narratives from elements that had no connection to one another. It is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of the human brain that functions the same way in highly intelligent people and in less informed people. Psychological studies on conspiracy theories consistently show that the predisposition to find conspiratorial explanations for events has no significant correlation with educational level. What does correlate is the need for control and certainty in a world perceived as chaotic, mistrust of established institutions, and the experience of feeling marginalized from official narratives. Put another way, the mud flood theory says nothing about the intelligence of those who believe it. It says something about their relationship with the world. And that is something that deserves compassion, not ridicule. Because there is something in the mud flood theory that points to a real need, to a real question that the official history sometimes fails to answer with sufficient generosity. What exactly happened in the 19th century? Because something did happen. Something extraordinary and unsettling and difficult to process. The 19th century was the century of the greatest transformation of human life since the Neolithic era. In the span of 2 or 3 generations, the world changed more than it had in the previous 2,000 years. Cities that had 100,000 inhabitants in 1800 had 1 million by 1900. Technology progressed from animal power to the steam engine, to electricity, to the first automobiles. Colonial empires built and destroyed entire civilizations. Cholera epidemics killed millions in successive waves. The Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian Wars, and imperial expansion in Asia and Africa, all in the same century. The people who lived in that century did indeed experience something that could legitimately be described as a world that collapsed and was rebuilt. Not because a mudslide came, but because the change was so rapid and so brutal that people born in 1800 and who died in 1880 did not recognize the world they inhabited at the end of their lives. That is not a metaphor. It is demography. It is economic history. It is social history. The children that the mudslide theory describes as replacement orphans after the catastrophe are real. The orphan trains that traveled across North America between the 1850s and 1920s existed. More than 250,000 children were placed in homes across the American Midwest and West through charitable organizations. But not because there was a mudslide that wiped out their parents. Because industrialization created a level of child poverty in the cities of the American Northeast that existing social structures could not absorb. Because the Civil War left tens of thousands of children without families. Because the massive influx of immigrants to New York, Boston, and Philadelphia created an overcrowding crisis that charitable institutions tried to resolve in the only way they knew how. Because infant mortality was high, maternal mortality during childbirth was high, and workplace accidents in factories were endemic. All of this is documented. It has been studied. There are names. There are records. There are individual stories of each of those children that survive in the archives. The mudslide theory takes that real fact, that real suffering, and turns it into evidence of a secret catastrophe, which, it must be said clearly, is bitterly ironic. Because in doing so, it erases exactly what should be preserved, the economic and social context that produced that real tragedy, which was 19th century industrial capitalism without regulation or social safety nets. That did happen. And burying it under the metaphor of the mud flood is, in a sense, doing exactly what the theory accuses the elites of doing. There is a question that is probably taking shape in the minds of our listeners by now. Why, then, do so many people believe in this? What makes this specific theory, with all its internal contradictions and all the alternative explanations available, have garnered audiences of tens of millions of people around the world? The answer has several layers. The first layer is the most superficial. The images work. Photographs of buried windows and deserted cities have an immediate visual power that no verbal explanation can instantly counter. Seeing is believing, and the brain accepts the image before rational analysis has time to intervene. The second layer runs deeper. The theory offers agency. In a world where the forces that shape daily life, financial markets, political decisions, technological changes, seem completely beyond the control of any individual, the conspiracy theory restores the sense that someone is in charge, that there is a plan, that there are identifiable actors, even if they are evil, with understandable objectives. It is strangely more comforting to know that there is an evil elite hiding the truth than to accept that the world is chaotic and that things sometimes simply happen without anyone fully controlling them. The third layer is the most important. The theory says something true at its core. Even if it says it in the wrong way, it says that the official story is incomplete. And that is true. It says that there are things the dominant narratives omit or downplay. And that is also true. It says that ordinary people have a right to ask questions about the past that do not always receive satisfactory answers. And that is completely true. The problem isn't curiosity. The problem isn't skepticism. The problem is that the answer the mud flood theory provides to those legitimate questions is one that cannot be verified, that doesn't need to be verified because it is constructed to be impossible to refute, and that in the process of explaining everything ends up explaining nothing. The real history of the 19th century, with its documented fires and its elevated cities and its immigrants and its orphans and its epidemics and its revolutions, is harder to tell. It requires more nuance. It has less narrative clarity. Those responsible are more diffuse, more systemic, harder to point a finger at, but it is real. And reality, even when it is complicated, is more useful than fiction, even when fiction is elegant. Now then, there is one aspect of all this that we have not yet touched upon, an aspect that completely changes the scope of what we are analyzing. We have explained where the theory comes from. We have seen that its roots lie in Russian scientific pseudo-nationalism of the 1970s. We have seen how those ideas were developed by Slavic occultists and ultra-nationalists who explicitly used them to construct a narrative of racial supremacy. And we have seen how, in 2016, those ideas were detached from their original context, washed of their most obvious political content, and relaunched as a narrative of universal loss, faceless, flagless, and without a visible agenda. That process of ideological laundering was not accidental. It wasn't the result of people sharing videos on YouTube in 2016 knowing the history of Fomenko or Levashov. The vast majority of them did not. Most of those who believed in the mud flood theory encountered it stripped of any political context, already transformed into a story of architectural mystery and lost civilization. But the origin matters. It matters to know that ideas presented as independent discoveries have a genealogy, that they did not arise out of nowhere upon observing a photograph from 1880, that they are the result of a specific intellectual process with specific motivations, which time and the journey through the internet have gradually erased. This does not mean that every person who believes in the theory is complicit in that origin. Most are not. Most came to the theory out of genuine curiosity, out of the completely legitimate impulse to ask questions about things they don't understand. But it does mean that it's worth knowing where what we believe comes from before we believe it. Let's talk now about the name, Tartaria, because there is something real in that name that the theory takes and distorts until it's unrecognizable, and that distortion is in itself an important lesson. Tartaria, or Tartary in English, was a real geographical name that Europeans used for several centuries to refer to a vast and vaguely defined region of Central Asia and Siberia. On European maps from the 16th to the 18th centuries, it appears consistently: China Tartaria, Independent Tartaria, Great Tartaria. It was not the name of an empire, it was a label born of ignorance. Europeans of that era knew that to the east of the territories they understood well lay something vast, inhabited by peoples they found difficult to classify, with nomadic traditions that did not fit into European political categories. And they called all of that Tartary, just as today we might call a region we do not know well the interior. By 1850, the systematic mapping of the world had advanced enough that the term was no longer necessary. Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Siberia, the northern Chinese territories, each region now had its own name and recognized borders. The term Tartary simply became obsolete. It didn't disappear from maps because someone hid it. It disappeared because geographical knowledge replaced it. That's all. That's what happened to Tartary. But there is something else in this story worth noting. The peoples who inhabited that region, the Tatars, the Mongols, the various ethnic groups of Central Asia, have an enormously rich documented history. They have real empires, those of Genghis Khan and his successors, which in the 13th century constituted the largest land empire in human history. They have architecture, they have literature, they have religion, they have philosophy, they have everything a civilization has. The mud flood theory doesn't speak of that. It doesn't mention the historical Mongols. It doesn't mention the peoples of Central Asia. It takes their names, empties them of content, and turns them into a label for an imaginary civilization of nebulous origin that built European and North American neoclassical buildings, which again has that particular irony. The theory that claims to recover and erase civilization erases in the process the real civilizations that inhabited those territories. We are reaching the point where everything we have explored becomes useful, because the question posed by a video like this is not merely academic. It is not just a matter of separating truth from fiction. It is a question about how we think, about how we evaluate the information that comes to us, about how we decide what to believe. And that question matters far more now than it did 10 years ago, because the environment in which we live produces more information per second than any previous generation in human history. Not all of that information is equal. Not all of it deserves the same level of credibility. But distinguishing between what is verifiable and what is speculative requires tools that aren't always explicitly taught to us. One of those tools is the simplest question of critical thinking. Could this explanation be disproved? Is there any possible evidence that, if it existed, would make me change my mind? A good scientific or historical theory can always answer yes to that question. It can tell you what kind of finding would refute it. The mud flood theory cannot. Any evidence against it is simply part of the conspiracy. Historical records that contradict it are forgeries. Experts who deny it are part of the cover-up. Alternative explanations are a distraction. A theory that cannot be refuted is no stronger than the others. It is weaker, because it doesn't need to compete with reality. The second tool is the question of the source. Where does this information come from? Who produces it? Using what methodology? What incentives does the disseminator have? A YouTube video with atmospheric music and photos of underground windows is a source. The 1889 records of the Seattle City engineer are another source. The two are not equivalent. And recognizing that difference is not intellectual elitism, it is common sense applied to information. The third tool is the hardest to use because it requires something the human ego does not readily concede: the willingness to say, "I don't know." The willingness to acknowledge that seeing a photo we don't fully understand doesn't force us to choose between the conspiracy theory and the official explanation. We may simply not know yet, and we can keep looking and verify and change our position when the evidence warrants it. That is the opposite of the certainty that the conspiracy theory offers, and that's why it's harder to sustain emotionally, but it's closer to the truth. We want to conclude with something we consider important. Most people who believed in the mudslide theory did so because something about it answered a real question they had. A question about the world they inhabit, about whether what they were taught is complete, about whether there are things that remain hidden, about whether human history includes catastrophes and resets that no one talks about openly. The answer to that last question is yes, without a doubt. Human history is full of catastrophes that for decades or centuries were downplayed, ignored, or outright suppressed from official narratives. The Tulsa Massacre of 1921, where a thriving African-American neighborhood was destroyed in 2 days of violence, was omitted from American history books for decades. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed between 2 and 3 million people while India was a British colony, does not occupy the place in history as taught that it should. The pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas, with their mathematical, architectural, and astronomical sophistication, were systematically described as primitive by the conquistadors who destroyed them. There are things the world did try to forget. There are stories that were indeed suppressed. There are voices that were indeed silenced. But not by a mudslide, for reasons far more concrete, far more human, far more understandable, and far more difficult to confront. Precisely because they have a name, they have a face, they have politics. The mudslide theory promises to reveal the hidden truth, but the hidden truth it reveals is a fantasy. The hidden truths it does not reveal, those are real. And they are in the archives, in the newspapers of the time, in the testimonies of the people who lived through it, available to anyone who wants to find them, without the need for any conspiracy to have hidden them, because the reason they are not better known is not active suppression. It is simply that no one made a video with piano music and old photographs to tell their stories. Perhaps that should be the next task for those who have a genuine curiosity about the past, not to search for the lost civilization that no one can verify, but for the real civilizations that did exist and that deserve to be told with the same urgency. If anything we explored today left you with more questions than answers, we're in the right place. Good questions are the beginning of everything. What distinguishes a good question from a bad one isn't the subject, it's where the search is headed, toward verification or toward confirming what we already believed. If you know someone who came across these images and was left with the feeling that something didn't add up, share this with that person. Not to convince them of anything, but so they have more evidence, more context, more real history to compare it with. And if you're not yet part of this community, join us. Every week we explore together the questions worth asking, with the rigor they deserve and the honesty to clearly state when something is verifiable and when it's speculation. The real history of the 19th century buried many things, but it wasn't the mud that buried them. Time buried them, and time, with enough curiosity and enough sources, can unearth them.